Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Kathy Sebring. I'm the program coordinator for the Norfolk Council on Aging, and I'm very pleased to present our digital photography demo and tips by Silvana Della Camera. Silvana is currently the president of the Stony Brook Camera Club in Franklin, and she's really an outstanding photographer. I've seen some of her work, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say. Thanks again for being here. I'm going to take my video off now too. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. All right, let's get going. So today we're going to talk about how to take a good photograph, and the concepts that I'm going to present, whether or not you have a digital camera or a film camera, or you just take snaps with your cell phone, these properties apply. The same topics and procedures apply. You may not be able to, adjust some things because you're using a cell phone, but sometimes you can set your cell phone into manual mode and you can adjust aperture and ISO and all kinds of stuff. So hopefully this will get you on a path to create more satisfying images to share with the world, and not only yourself and your friends and family. So I am a big fan of classic photographers. Dorothea Lange was a pioneer, and she photographed a lot of the Dust Bowl during the Depression. And a lot of these photographers have comments and quotes that really put a perspective on the whole idea of photography. Photography takes an instant out of time, altering life by holding it still. And that is quite true. Whenever you take a photograph or look back on photographs from long ago, it brings to life, it brings everything back to you from that point in time. So people that have, changed, people that are no longer with us, we still have those instants that we can look back on. So there are 4 basics of taking a good photograph, and it revolves around understanding light and how the exposure affects the image. So we're going to talk about aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and framing. And this is also known as composition. I don't think of composition in the same way that you often hear. I consider it framing, because unless you're doing still life photography, you're not really composing anything. You're just actually framing something that already exists, and you're putting it into context. And we're going to talk about capturing the light. And then when you get all that, you're going to start asking yourself questions. So let's talk about aperture. What exactly aperture is? And it is your camera's pupil, and it works just like our eyes, or in this case a kitty cat's eyes, where when the aperture is wide open, the pupil is wide open, and that's the same application for a lens. It's the condition of the lens where the most light comes in. And when you stop it down, you close the aperture, the numbers go up, and the pupil becomes quite small, so there's less light coming into the camera. And here's a diagram that shows you really what it looks like when you're looking into a lens. An aperture of 1.4 is very wide. It's very light sensitive, and as you increase the shutter, it stops down, so less and less light comes in. And this has an effect on your image. It controls the depth of field. It not only controls the amount of light coming into the camera, it controls the depth of field. So what am I talking about, depth of field? So the lower the number, the shallower the depth of field. A shallow depth of field brings the viewer's eye immediately to the subject, because the focus is on that particular part of your image, and because you're using a very shallow depth of field, everything around it is soft. It's out of focus, so the eye is drawn immediately to the point that's in focus. Bokeh, you often see this or hear about it. it describes the way a lens renders the area that's out of focus. Contrary, a large f-stop creates a deeper depth of field. Sharpness can be throughout, from the foreground to the background. And I have an asterisk there for a reason, and we'll get into that shortly. And when you have a very high f-stop, you can create starburst effects on lights and the sun, and I'll show you what that looks like. And your eye always searches for the point that's in focus in an image. So if you ever see an out of focus image, you have almost like a sense of, you know, there's an unsettling feeling that you get because your eye is not satisfied. It's looking for something that's sharp and it's not there. So here's an example of a guitar using different apertures. So at 1.8, pretty wide, you'll notice that the guitar has only a very small area that's in focus. Everything else, from the foreground to the background, everything's out of focus. As we increase the aperture, more and more of the guitar becomes in focus. So you start to see more of the neck in focus. Here, we start to see even the headstock starting to become more in focus until, for this particular lens, the aperture goes up to f16. Every lens is going to be different, but for this example, we're looking at a lens that has a maximum aperture of f16. And then at this point, everything is in focus on the guitar, from the bridge all the way to the headstock. So your eye is traveling back and forth because everything's in focus. Whereas here, you only have a small area that's in focus and your eye is immediately drawn to it. So this is using the aperture on your lens is a very powerful way to identify to the viewer what's important in your image. Here's an image that I shot a couple of years ago. This was shot at a very wide aperture, f2.8. And the only thing that's really sharp in focus is the crystal goblet. You can see the Christmas tree in the background, and the round circular, that's called specular highlights. That's the bokeh of the lens. This particular lens has really nice bokeh. It renders light and background in a really creamy, soft way, and it renders lights into discs. And again, it brings your eye to the goblet, which is in focus. Here's another image. This was shot at f5.3. So now I stopped down the aperture. The lens is more closed. So there's more in focus in this image because of the aperture. The lobster traps in the foreground are quite sharp. And in the background, even though it's out of focus, you can still identify it's what you're looking at. You're looking at boats, trees, and hills. So the focus is the buoys in the foreground, and because it's red and your eye immediately goes to something that's red, even if it's out of focus, the fact that the entire pile of buoys is in sharp focus, it keeps your eye within the frame of the image. Now, contrary to what I've just been saying, here's the twist. When you're focusing on something up close, and in this case, I'm focusing on a milkweed, which is quite small, and I'm really up close to the milkweed. Even though the aperture is quite high, it's at f7.1, the only thing that's in true focus is the milkweed filaments and nothing else. The little branch is out of focus, the background is out of focus, and it draws your eye to the delicate filaments of this milkweed. So aperture is important even when you're shooting at high aperture on something up close. An experiment. You can take a bunch of pictures and change the aperture and see what the image looks like. Here is Situate light. This was shot pretty much at high noon, and I stopped down the aperture to f14. And if you look closely at this image, it's sharp from the base of the lighthouse all the way out into the distance, the shore, all the way to the top of the lighthouse. And because the aperture is stop down f14, it renders a starburst effect on the sun. So again, if I wanted to have only a part of the lighthouse in sharp focus, I would have put the aperture wide open so your eye was only drawn to that one particular place. Because everything is sharp in this image, your eye kind of naturally travels around. Shutter speed. The shutter of your camera works just like the shutter on a window. When you open it, it lets in light. When you shut it, it goes down. And depending on the speed of it, it controls the amount of light hitting your sensor. So effectively, the faster the shutter speed, the more an object is frozen. So whenever you look at, like, say, images like kids playing sports or photographs of professional players, those are shot at a very high shutter speed to freeze the action. On the opposite end, slow shutter speeds capture and it conveys movement and the passing of time. When you're using long shutter speeds, you need to stabilize your camera. If you're just hand holding a camera using a long shutter speed, you're going to introduce movement because you're just not able to hold the camera steady enough. So you want to use a tripod or put it on something firm to take the photograph. Here's an example of very slow shutter speed. This is a 20-second exposure. And the beauty of using long exposures on water, be it flat or waterfalls, is it renders the water in a very silky method. It looks creamy, it looks silky. So if I shot the same image at a fast shutter speed, the water would have ripples, it would have a choppiness to it. But the fact that I chose to shoot this at 20 seconds, it renders the water very smoothly, and it implies motion. Here is the Brooklyn Bridge. This is yet another very long exposure. It's 30 seconds long, and I used a relatively high f-stop. It's an f10, which allowed the lights of the Brooklyn Bridge to have starbursts. Now, because it was a long exposure, the water is smoothed out. So the ripples of that, on the water, they're basically eliminated. It erases it because of the long exposure. And I caught the party boat that was going by, and when you're photographing something that's moving with a slow shutter speed, it tends to basically erase itself. So you can't see that the boat looks translucent, and I only ended up catching the light. So it's a very creative effect when you're using long shutter speeds. Here's another image. This is only a 2-second image, 2-second exposure. And people were walking along the road, and as they walked, because it's a long exposure, they started basically disappearing. So they have like this ghost-like effect. And if you look at the middle of the frame, the people that are sitting down, they're sharp because they're not moving. But the people that are moving, they're disappearing. So it conveys a sense of movement and kind of a sense of creepiness too, if you think about it. Here's another long exposure. Again, I'm fascinated by moving water. This is a it's an 1/8 of a second exposure. This particular fountain, it was basically a fountain waterfall thing. This is in Dublin. And you couldn't tell that the stones that were behind the water, because the water was rushing very rapidly and it was very turbulent. But because I chose to use a slow shutter speed, it silkened the water and it made it transparent, so you could see the composition of the stones. And because I chose a very high aperture, even the leaves in the back are very sharp. This is a couple of years ago, I photographed this in my backyard. It was one of those wild storms that came on in early autumn, and it was wild, very strong wind, and this oak tree was going back and forth. And so I was like, oh, this is going to be cool. So I ran in and got my camera and set it up with a neutral density filter because it was daylight. So this is a 30-second exposure, and it rendered the tree kind of like a cottony, very soft looking. And it's because the leaves were tree was going back and forth so violently, it looked soft and gentle, but the reality was it was anything but. And this is an infrared image, and that's why it kind of looks kind of funky. Here's another waterfall. This is only 1.6 seconds. And this again was a pretty good rushing water. It wasn't a delicate waterfall, but the fact that the slow shutter speed was used, it rendered the waterfall, the water coming down, very silky and very soft looking. On the opposite side of the spectrum, fast shutter speeds. Whenever you're photographing birds, especially because they're so fast, you want to use a very high shutter speed. And this snowy owl, they're very, very fast. And I was able to capture him in a glide, and he, his beautiful feathers are nice and sharp. And that's, again, because of the very high shutter speed. This is a geyser in Iceland. This particular geyser erupts about every 8 minutes. So it took me a while to capture this because it was like a guessing game. Am I ready? Am I not ready? And I finally caught it, and I chose to use a very high shutter speed because it goes up and down so fast I needed to freeze it. Now, the beauty of using a very high shutter speed is that I was able to freeze the water droplets of the geyser. So it gives you a closer view of what this thing is actually doing. It's literally made up with, billions of water droplets, but it was cool to see it up close when I zoomed into the image, the fine drops. ISO. ISO is the sensitivity standard rating. It applies to film and digital. The 70s, the sensitivity rating on film was called ASA, and way before digital came along, they changed the rating to be called ISO. It's an international standard, and the same type of sensitivity, again, applies to both film and digital. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive and lighter the image, and film is the same way. If you're using a film with very high ISO, it's very sensitive, very delicate, but it also introduces other issues. So when you're shooting, always try to shoot at the lowest native ISO. What is the native ISO? Each camera has a base ISO, also known as native ISO, which is the ISO at which the camera is most sensitive and has it has the greatest dynamic range. And the dynamic range is the ability to capture a lot of detail across the range of light, from darkness to the very bright. So that's really the goal that you want to do, is use the native ISO, and I'll show you the reason why. When you use higher ISO, it gives you greater sensitivity, especially in like dark scenes, but there's a cost involved with it. It introduces more noise, it's very grainy, and you lose dynamic range. Here is an example. Over here, we have an image using the camera's the base ISO, the native. And if you look closely, there's like shadows in here, there's filaments, very like delicate details to this. As we start increasing ISO, you start losing detail. You start losing the filaments and the shadows, and you start like introducing a lot of grain until you hit, for this camera, the highest is 12,800. it's basically a colorful sandy mess. And there's no way to recover really easily. Right now there's tools, there's a lot of great software that you can use to help remove graininess, but it's extra work, and there's no guarantee that you'll be able to recover all the detail that you originally had at this point. So use it creatively, but just understand its pitfall. Now, we're putting it all together, the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. And when you put them all together, different effects are created. So in this case, we're using a very wide aperture. The lens is wide open. We're using a very fast shutter speed. So here we are. Your eye immediately goes to this in focus flower. The background's nice and soft, and it's out of focus, which draws your eye here. And because it's a fast shutter speed, even if there was wind, this wouldn't be moving. The flower's in focus. Now we start increasing the aperture, and whenever you adjust one thing, in this case we're leaving the ISO static, but we're playing with the aperture and the shutter speed, because all of these things are fluid. You start seeing some more detail become more apparent in the background as we go up, until we get up to a fairly high aperture. You'll notice that, you know, even the rocks and the fence is pretty much in focus. So it's a 1/30th of a second, which is pretty good to still freeze things, but not really if there's like a lot of movement. But you see more of the background. So it's a matter of choice, what your goal is when you're photographing something. How much do you want to have the eye roaming in the frame? So now that you have the calculation of the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, that equals your exposure. If your camera has a histogram, and most DSLRs and mirrorless have the ability to show you a histogram, it'll give you a lot of information about the amount of light in your image. And a lot of times your LCD, when you take a picture, you're looking at it and go, oh, that's pretty good. But when you take it off your camera, you go, ooh, it's overexposed. And that's because your camera will convert the image to JPEG. So it already processes it for you, and it gives you an idea of what you caught, but sometimes it lies to you. So the proper way, or the best way rather, to understand the amount of light in your image is to reference your histogram. So you can turn on the visibility in your menus. So highly recommend that you check that out. This is a properly exposed image. This is a bell curve. So the idea for any image is to avoid the extremes. Extreme to the right means that you lost a lot of detail because everything's blown out. And on the opposite spectrum, if this was pushed all the way to the left, it means that your image is too dark. So balance it, you know, keep an eye on your histogram, and, you know, take a few shots using different settings and see what you end up with. Ansel Adams, the master of the darkroom. He epitomized making photographs. He would take an image and then take it into the lab in the darkroom, and then process it, dodge and burn it to the way he felt it looked, what it felt like when he photographed it. So you're essentially doing the same thing. We all do the same thing. We're not taking a photograph, we're making it. And same principles apply, even though we don't have a physical dark room, we have a digital dark room. So let's get into framing. There are two basic, that's good English, basic compositional approaches: symmetry and non-symmetry. Symmetry is very easy. Center the subject and you're done. Non-symmetry is difficult because it involves balancing the empty space, aka the lack of objects, to the objects in the frame. It's more difficult, but you end up having a more dynamic and pleasing image in the end. And as the photographer, it is up to you to frame the scene and to have it be conveyed to the viewer in the way that you want it to be. You know, there's a story and you want to have the viewer see the story that you're trying to convey. Rules of thirds. Basically, you divide your image into thirds. And a lot of cameras have, you can turn on grids in your image, actually in your viewfinder, that can help you frame your image accordingly. In this case, the rule of thirds means that you don't really want anything in the center, although there is a center grid. Images that have primary objects that are off center tend to be more pleasing to the eye. So you try to get the objects kind of like on this kind of line, or at a cross, wherever like the two lines cross, that renders an image more pleasing compositionally. I position the sun pretty much here. So the primary elements in this image, the two strongest ones, are the position of the sun and this palm tree. And this is the rule of thirds. Now, I'm a firm believer of learning the rules and then breaking them, because rules are guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules. So learn the compositional framing rules and subsequently break them, because you're the artist here. You're the one that is trying to, you know, put forward something that's important to you. Okay, here's another one. This here is an infrared image. And if you look at the rule of thirds, I've got this tree hugging this particular line, and you want to keep an eye on leading lines when you're photographing. When you're looking at an image, look for lines, curvatures, or angles, and put them to use. In this case, I used the angle of the pond, this curve of the pond, to draw the eye first to this tree and then to the fountain out in the distance. Here is a lotus flower, clearly. And what I did was, I'm using angles here. There's a triangle. Look for geometric shapes in your image that you're looking at. They're kind of invisible at the, you know, immediately looking at something, but if you look close enough and you start to see a geometric shape, use that in your image to align everything. Such as this lotus flower, where I use the triangle to guide the eye from one position of the frame to the lotus flower and back out and up and around. This one here, it's not really apparent, but there is a circle here. The boats are aligned and it forms like kind of a circle. So your eyes are starting by the lighthouse, coming out and going back. And it helps the viewer keep their eye in the image and not go off. And it keeps interest. This is one of my favorite quotes by Robert Capa. If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. This one here struck me hard way back when. I was like, whoa, let me think about this. And go back to your images and see, take a look at the ones that are your favorites and see how they differ from other ones that are similar or not so similar, and why that is. Choose the subject. When you're choosing your subject, be a miser. Think of painters. They start off with a blank canvas and then they selectively add objects and colors onto it, and that produces the finished painting. Photographers, we have a little bit more difficult because the canvas is already full, and it's up to us to eliminate consciously objects that are distracting from the subject that we're interested in, and that results in a good photograph. So look at something, decide, oh, that's an interesting subject, but look around it, see what's there that's detracting from it, and position yourself accordingly so you can eliminate them. And get in close. Fill the frame with your subject, and it will make your photo look so much better without wasted space. If there are elements around your subject, see what's available so you can use them to frame your subject. First time I saw Big Ben, I was awestruck. Photographs don't convey size that well. So when I came out of the tube and rounded the corner, I literally gasped at the size of the enormity of this tower. And I struggled to find a point of view that kind of gave you a sense of its massive size. And I decided to shoot this differently. Instead of shooting it from a distance, I got up close. So I went really tight up against this wrought iron fence, and I shot up. So I filled the frame with the tower. And I think for me, it gives a better point of reference to the enormity of the size of this tower. So fill the frame. Purple, my favorite color. These orchids were shockingly purple. And so I was on a quest to photograph them. These are down at the Naples Botanical Garden, and they're right by the entrance. So there were tons of people going in and out, and difficult to properly frame it. So what I did was I got far away and I used a long telephoto lens, and I filled the frame with the orchid. This is not an uncropped image. And I was able to eliminate the distracting flowers that were nearby and eliminate the people that were pretty much blocking my view. So fill the frame and see how much more your image has impact. Again, filling the frame. I love bees. I just think they're just magnificent. And I try to photograph them as much as I can. So I try to get in close, use a long lens because they, we don't want to, they're kind of skittish. So I tried to fill the frame with the flower and the bee. And if I had more flowers, because this was like, a bunch of flowers in a flower bed, it wouldn't have had the same impact of the detail of the bee and the detail of the petals of the flower. So get in close, whether or not you're physically doing it or using a telephoto lens, fill your frame. Grapes. Who doesn't like wine? I know some. I'm not one of them. This here could be a vineyard anywhere in the world. It could be in Italy. It could be in France, Australia, Peru. This happened to be in Napa, but I didn't want to take a picture of just the vineyard. I wanted to make it, the image implies, it's self-explanatory that it is in a vineyard, but I wanted to show the enormity and the detail of the vine and the grapes themselves. So think about context. If you're zooming in on a particular element, do you really need to show everything else, to set the place? Sometimes it's implied. So think about the story. Again, getting up close. This was the strangest poppy I've ever seen, and it was gorgeous. It's like a crinkly satin thingamabob, and I just thought it was beautiful. So I zoomed in close and made the background basically get out of focus. So the focus of your eye goes on the bloom itself. So pay close attention to your backgrounds. They can, make or break your image. Many times of weeding the garden and getting distracted. This was one summer morning. I woke up bright and early to weed the garden. So I went out there, started weeding, and I stopped. I ran in, got my camera, ran back out, and was enthralled by this dandelion that was covered with dew. So that took care of my weeding adventure for the morning, for at least for a few hours. So look closely. You'd be surprised at what exists right underneath your nose, and fill the frame. Autumn. Look around, because when you think about autumn, you think of like big trees full of color, but you don't have to take a picture of you know, a tree grove that's full of color, even though it's beautiful. You can take a close-up of a leaf and still show a sense of time. In this case, it's autumn, and it's this maple leaf sitting on a wooden bench full of lichen. And keep an eye on leading lines. This image has more visual impact because the lines are at a diagonal. If the lines were perfectly horizontal or vertical, it wouldn't have as much impact visually, because when you would put something at an angle, it creates a more dynamic image. So keep an eye on lines in your image. Milkweed. I'm a sucker for milkweed. I think I have a thing for seeds in general, maybe. I don't know. But I think this was a really beautiful plant. So I took a photograph of the beautiful filaments of the milkweed. Framing, using elements to frame your subject. One of the things that is really good to get into the habit of is, once you're walking along, turn around. You'd be surprised that the image that you're looking for is behind you. So always turn around when you're you know, in a place, because you'd be surprised at what you miss. When you're walking along, it looks a particular way, but when you turn around, things appear that looked, either you missed or it looked completely different. This is a cemetery in Ireland, and when I walked out of the gate and turned around, that's when the image became presented itself. So I used the gate to frame the headstone. So use frame elements that are available to frame your subject. Again, turning around. This is in Ireland, and walking in Killarney. This is the Killarney National Park. And the jaunty car went by, and I turned around, and bam, that was the image for me. That was it just appeared, because the castle was out in the distance, and I had the trees framing the jaunty car, as well as the hills and so forth. Yusuf Karash. You may have seen his images. He was a master of creating portraits. He created some powerful portraits of Winston Churchill during World War II. And here's another quote that keep in mind. Look and think before opening the shutter. The heart and mind are the true lens of the camera. And it's true. You know, you have a camera in your hand, but you're the one that tells it what to do. You're like a, you know, you have a car, you're the one driving it. You're driving your camera, same concept. So when you get someplace, take the time to survey and really soak it all in. Slow down. Don't immediately start taking pictures, because then you start missing important things because you're already busy snapping away. Move around. Isolate the subject by shooting from a low angle or a high. So move around, constantly move while you're looking at something, because the proper framing will present itself. Eliminate distracting backgrounds. And when you're photographing animals and children, it's really important to get down to their level. Shooting from the top looking down doesn't you don't capture the essence of that child or that animal because you're not at eye level with them. There are always two people in every picture, the photographer and the viewer. That is true. Bee again. Stalking bees and their polleny butt and the delicate flower. I really like purple, so again, purple flower. And it's really important to get eyes in focus, whether you're photographing a person or an insect, in this case, a bee, you want to make sure that the eye is in focus. I photographed a dedication, a memorial in Pepperell a couple of years ago, and the monuments are very striking. They're cutouts in gray granite, and I positioned myself shooting through. Shooting through is a very good way to have a certain effect. In this case, I shot through the actual monument and photographed the soldier in the background saluting. This is the Opera House in Iceland, and this is an amazing structure. It's all glass. You're kind of like lost on how to properly photograph this. So again, I decided to get up close to really show the structure. And in this case, it's basically a bunch of glass hexagons put together. And in the end, I decided to flip it to black and white. Again, get close. This I shot downtown. And this was cool because you're just walking along, looking around. And this struck me wild because I was looking at, centuries of layers of centuries, one of them. And this was a single frame, took it home, and I was like, I like this. And that's what it is. Back in England. This was around sunset, golden hour. And right by the Big Ben, there are a line of prime ministers, statues. And I really loved the Winston Churchill one. And I was trying to somehow frame this that I could get the statue and Big Ben. And there were hundreds of people milling around. So because sometimes you have to become a contortionist when you're photographing. So in order to eliminate the people below the statue, because the statue is kind of high, but not really, I positioned myself in a twisted way to get this image. So not a lot of editing here, just a small crop. Again, in Ireland, this had a ton of people behind the headstones, but because I dropped myself low, I eliminated them from my image. So again, move around and position yourself because you can properly get your subject in the frame without requiring a lot of editing in post to eliminate elements that you don't want there. Light. Let's talk about capturing the light. Wherever there is light, one can photograph. And that is true. Photography is capturing the light. It comes from the Greek and it means draw with light. And that's what we're doing when we're photographing. So see the light. And when I mean see the light, I mean that literally. See where the light's coming from. Is it coming from above? Is it coming from an angle? Is it coming from behind you? Pay attention to where the light is coming from. Any interesting shadows? Shadows are a really cool thing to photograph. They're a subject in and onto themselves. How's the light interacting with the scene or the subject? Don't be afraid to use flash on bright sunny days. Because flash fills in shadows and it helps you get an even exposure. This was shot in the middle of winter. That's usually when I like to go to the beach. I'm not a sun worshiper, so winter and the beach are a perfect thing for me. But it was a very cloudy day, and I didn't do anything to this image in post, but I was struck by the monochromatic look of it, and the sun rays, you know, the God rays coming through the clouds. But there's a lot of texture in this image. And I hadn't noticed when I shot this, but I ended up getting a seagull in the middle of the frame. Again, light. This was a very cloudy day, and cloudy days are awesome to go shooting because it's basically a big softbox. You don't have a lot of shadows. If you look closely at this image, there's no harsh shadows at all, and that's because of the clouds. You can see a lot of detail on the horse. You can see the grain and detail on the rocks. So on a cloudy day, you know, people think, oh, you need sunshine for good photographs. No, no, no. Clouds. You like clouds. Go out. Sometimes you're forced to deal with a sunny day. So I positioned myself so that the sun was behind the light on the carousel, and I was able to kind of get an interesting shot of the Eiffel Tower. Neutral density filters. It's, again, smooths out the water, and you're able to slow down time. And when you slow your shutter, you can get the movement of the clouds, and it softens the breaking water on the rocks. So use modifiers. They help your photograph become much more interesting. Again, a sunny day. Nauset light. I positioned again myself behind, you know, so the sun was right behind the lighthouse, and I got a nice starburst. Light is constantly moving. It changes constantly, so keep an eye on, you know, the scene. Sometimes something that has no interest to you suddenly becomes alive because the light suddenly changes. Again, cloudy days are your friend. It's like having a big softbox, and it's wonderful to shoot flowers and so forth. Golden hour. It's the time of day photographers crave because it gives the subject a warm light. And golden hour happens right before sunset or right before sunrise. Blue hour is the period after the golden hour, if it's in the afternoon, or right before golden hour in the morning. And it has a really beautiful blue light. And between the hours of 10 and 2 p.m., that's the hour that has the harsh shadows, unless it's cloudy. So use your flash to fill in shadows. This is dawn down on the Cape. And dawn light is, to me, has a different look than sunset. It's more blue than sunset because sunset has more of a warmer tinge. But when the sun is low on the horizon, you get a lot of texture in, like, for example, the sand. There's a lot of ripples, and you can really see it. This is late morning sun, and late morning sun is beautiful, meaning this is around 9 o'clock, and it eliminates a lot of harsh shadows, and there's a lot of nice backlight for this lotus. Golden hour. Everything literally has a golden tinge, and it's a very soft light, and it's very pleasing for portraits as well. Sunset. Just like sunrise, the sun that's low on the horizon really brings out detail. So you can see the ripples in the sand, and it's nice to have silhouettes as well. This is civil twilight. There's 4 types of night after sunset. So you have civil twilight, astronomical twilight, darkness, and I'm having a brain methane moment. It'll come to me. But this here is the time of day when you use a neutral density filter, the peach colors in the horizon really stand out. So it's a really nice time of day to photograph. And again, when you're slowing the shutter, it makes water surfaces glassy. This is the blue hour, literally. Water's blue, sky is a beautiful shade of blue. And this light in the darkness. I do a lot of night photography and I'm a big Milky Way fiend. So even at night, in the darkest night, there is light. We can't see it because our eyes are pretty pathetic, but the camera is very sensitive and it can capture the magnificence of the night sky. So now ask yourself, what do I want others to see? What are you photographing and why are you photographing it? What does the viewer need to see? And how will you get them to see it? Thank you. Do you have any questions?
I don't see any questions, but this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Silvana.
Oh, thank you. If you want to open it up to the attendees, if they want to ask any questions.
Okay. I have a question. Are you going to show some of the photos from our contest?
I am.
Okay.
Coming right up.
Oh,
we can do that now.
Does anyone else have any questions? If they want to unmute themselves, feel free to ask or comment or anything.
Okay. So we'll get into the contest images.
Great, thank you.
So keep shooting. The more you photograph, the better your eye becomes and the better photographer you become. Contact information. And we'll look at what brings you joy photo contest.
And it looks like we do have a quick question before we go to the contest.
Sure.
Someone asked, what is infrared filtering?
Infrared, okay. Infrared is when you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, there's a very small sliver called visible light, and this is what humans can see and most animals. Insects have a greater bandwidth of ability to see light, and infrared is a section of the spectrum past the red. When you think of a rainbow, it goes red to indigo. Infrared's on the red side, and I have you can modify a camera to, they remove the IR filter. So your camera behaves like our eyes behave. When you remove that filter, it allows the camera to capture a greater bandwidth of the electromagnetic spectrum. So my camera is able to capture a bandwidth much larger on the right-hand side of the red part of the visible spectrum. And infrared is what is used for surveillance. Like they use it a lot for aerial surveillance of plants. It's able to see disease. It's used a lot in forensics. It just is able to capture things that are not visible to the naked eye. So that's what infrared is. Hope that makes sense.
And I think we had another question about the contest. I don't know if Kathy wants to talk about that real quick.
Hi. We have a question about the contest.
Someone was asking about the contest. No one told me. So maybe if you just want to explain it.
Well, this is going to be the culmination of the contest right now. Silvana is going to show us the entries, and we're going to have a winner, which will be announced in about a few minutes.
Exciting.
Yes.
This was a photo contest through the Council on Aging.
Yes, thank you to everyone for submitting your photos. We had some very interesting ones.
Yeah, nice job. So we'll get into the contest, and if anything other questions come up, I'll be happy to answer them. So what brings you joy? This is a great shot. This is the essence of freezing a moment. You know, I captured 3 children in midair, and this is something that you would use a high shutter speed on. Oh, excuse me. Beautiful color in this one. Again, lovely color. This would have been even stronger if you got closer to the flower itself, but nicely done. Looks like spring. Feels like it's so far away today. Bird feeders. Bird feeders are a great place to photograph, you know, get your skills on freezing their little wings. Winter. Feels like today. Nice photojournalistic feel to this. Don't we all wish we were there now? Nice sunset. Again, freezing a moment. This could have used a little bit faster shutter speed, but nice capture of you know, children having a blast. Nice capture of a bird. Birds for me are difficult to capture. It's a hit or miss. So nicely done on this. And this is a beautiful shot. And congratulations, contest winner. Beautiful cardinal.
That's great. Now, is Paul here in our audience? I'm not sure if anybody can hear.
They may have to mute themselves.
There is a Paul.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Have we misspelled your name, Paul? Are you Paul Cochran? Are you the photographer of this winning photo?
Yes, I am, but you misspelled my name.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's all right. C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
And it's pronounced Paul Cochran, correct?
Correct.
All right. Beautiful photo. Thank you so much for submitting.
Paul. Wonderful.
Well done.
Yeah.
This is a great capture.
They're beautiful, the female cardinal.
They really are. And they're so skittish. I commend you on your, you know, your skills to capture cardinals, because the minute you like move, they're gone. But this is just beautiful.
I was having breakfast and I shot them from the breakfast table through the window.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Lots of patience.
And I used a 300 millimeter lens for that.
Really nice. I love the snow on the beak.
Yes, I'm glad you just noticed that.
Oh yeah, I zoomed right in. I was like, oh my God, look at the snow on the beak. And there's a little bit of snow on these tiny feathers under her beak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful.
She's beautiful. Yep. Thank you.
No, thank you.
So, Silvana, there was one other question, if I could just circle back.
Sure.
You turned around in Ireland to get the car leaving. Did you have to change settings beforehand? Were your settings ready, point and shoot?
That was shot with a 28 to 300 millimeter lens. And I turned around, saw it, put my camera up to my eye and hit focus and fired. So I don't really futz around. I adjust on the fly. It's not like I play around with settings and then take a picture. I pretty much shoot in manual mode. I set my shutter speed and I put my ISO in auto ISO. So the camera will adjust once I decide on the focal, you know, the aperture and the shutter speed that I want to use, I let the camera decide what it needs for ISO to get proper exposure.
How do you find the base ISO of your camera? Is that the lowest ISO?
No, it's not the lowest, because your camera can actually go lower or even higher than, it's like a fake low or a fake high. So if you see like L and the number, that's not the base ISO. So say you put your camera in ISO 100 and then you step down to the next lower one. If it has L on it, that's like the fake low, because it does like exposure compensation for you to get lower. But if you have like, if you hit 100 and then hit L when you go lower, 100 is your base.
Okay.
Okay.
It's the one before L.
The one before L. My Nikon D850 has a base ISO of 64, which is, it's incredibly, has a huge dynamic range. So for that one, when you get into low, it gets into like really ridiculously low. And alternately, when you go to high, if you want to find out what your high ISO is, same thing applies. If you start seeing the H for the high, that's like the modified one that the camera just, you know, does a manipulation under the covers for you.
Okay. And can you can you view the histogram while you're composing the photograph?
Some cameras you can in live view.
In live view, okay.
Yep. You can turn it on. Yep.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you very much. This is great.
You're very welcome.
Like there was another question. Is there a book you favor that provides more depth to the technical components that you discussed and presented this afternoon?
Book. I'm all over the place. I tend to read manuals. I try to learn my camera as best I can. I confess I'm a camera hound. Some women collect shoes. I collect cameras. But if like I'm a Nikon shooter, there are various authors that dedicate entire volumes on particular cameras, and from there I learn a lot. And what I like, for me, I read Tom Hogan a lot, Steve Perry, and once you learn one camera, you can apply the same concepts to any other camera. Excuse me, and the concepts are the same. So if you learn your camera, it will come to you. You'll understand ISO, you'll understand shutter speed, you'll understand aperture, and I suggest getting one of those specific for your own camera, because you'll learn how to use your camera, and you also learn the concepts of exposure.
When I got my new camera a couple of years ago, I went on YouTube and I got a 47-minute YouTube video on how to operate my particular camera, a Nikon, by Tony Northrup.
Yep.
And he's got a book called How to Create Stunning Digital Photography, which is, I don't know, a couple hundred, 230 pages. And it's, I use it all the time.
Yeah. So are you a Canon shooter?
No, I got a Nikon 55.
Okay. Check out, he's very good. Check out Tom Hogan.
I will.
Tom Hogan and Steve Perry, fabulous Nikon books. Really, really good. I'm a big night photography person, so I read Royce Blair. Royce Blair does fabulous books. So if you look online, and you'll find out some books that pertain to your particular interest, and they're very helpful. In fact, on my blog, I have some stuff there, which actually I'm in the process of putting together a workshop. So a lot of times the concepts I put on my blog. So you just gave me incentive to compile some books that are recommended. So I'll share it with Kathy once it's available, and she could share it with you guys.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
But I really recommend, I've looked at that Tony Northrup video on my camera at least half a dozen times, because if you're not used to using all the controls of these digital cameras, it can get confusing until you really get used to it,
Yep, it's true. they're amazing powerhouses. I mean, it's they do so much, and most users, we tend to just scratch the surface on their abilities.
All right. Well, thank you again, Silvana. This has really been great. I love the photos. Thank you to all our contestants, and congratulations to Paul Cochran for the winning photo.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you. It's terrific.
Well, thank you for everybody's time. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank
you, everyone.
Bye-bye.